Every few years, entertainment likes to cycle through specific historical eras. Whether it's pirates or Vikings or gladiators, there's something enticing about watching a fictional story set in a time period that really happened. Right now, entertainment is going through a samurai phase, most notably with Shogun. And this is one of my personal favorite historical eras to learn about. Rise of the Ronin came out last month, and it's the game that I've been spending the most time on lately. I was sold on it immediately because it's samurai with guns, and as a combat system, that's a lot of fun. But the particular historical period in which it takes place is incredibly interesting. Imagine this. You're in Japan in 1603, and you experience nothing but peace for the next 250 years. No wars, there's orderly society, a booming economy. The streets are teeming with samurai, artisans, merchants, and entertainers. Shops are lined with exquisite kimono. Food stalls sell soba and sushi. Theaters showcase kabuki performances, and not a single foreigner is to be seen. But all of a sudden, ships, unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen before, armed with massive cannons, blowing thick black smoke from modern coal-powered steam engines, pull up directly off the coast of Japan. In an instant, stability across the entire Japanese nation is shattered. Enter the Bakumatsu era. On July 8, 1853, 4 U.S. naval warships led by Commodore Matthew C. Perry arrived on the shores of Japan to open up trade routes with the United States. The Japanese had never witnessed military power like this. They called their menacing ships with the billowing black smoke Kurofune, black ships. Commodore Perry arrived in Uraga at the entrance to Edo Bay, which, by the way, is modern-day Tokyo Bay. And for some context, if you've ever seen that giant Gundam statue in Odaiba, Perry and his crew pulled into that same bay, but about an hour away. Lastly, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. We're trying to get to 300K. So Commodore Perry pulls up with an entourage, a threat, right? He's got 4 ships, 382 men, a whole lot of weapons, and a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore demanding Japan open the ports to the U.S. Now, let's remember something here. Other than a bit of very controlled trade with the Dutch and Chinese, Japan's been cut off, isolated, and protected from the rest of the world for 250 years. That's like generations of families. I don't know if I can communicate how bananas it had to have been to suddenly see Americans on your shore. We'll just try this thought experiment here. Imagine this scenario happening today. Think about your worldview right now, your culture, your food that you eat, the fashion that you wear. Now, adding another layer to it, think about what ethnic background you are. And this is important. Think about your ethnicity and imagine that everyone around you in your whole entire now hypothetical country is of the exact same ethnicity. If you're mixed race, then everyone around you is the same mixed race. Everyone, okay? So think about those two things. Now everything in your hypothetical country gets shut off from the rest of the world. No communication, no social media with the outside world, no import-export of goods or foods, no world news, etc. Now keep fast forwarding from 2024 all the way to boom, 2274. And all of a sudden you see ships. The technology is foreign, it's years ahead. The ship is full of people who look nothing like you've ever laid your eyes on. As far as you know, nobody in your entire hypothetical country has ever looked like the people on these ships. They want you to open up trade and communication. They want to take your power, your independence. You fear them, but you're also intrigued. You want to stay safe, but you want to learn. You want to know what they know. Everything is new. So much has happened between 2024 and 2274. So how do you proceed? And after that initial flex and dropping off the president's demands, Perry and his crew leave Japan, but with promises of returning. And while his physical presence was gone, he left a formidable crack in the foundation, one that would eventually cause civil war and crumble the feudal system. And of course, we'll get into how samurai and ronin fit into the puzzle. But first, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Audible. Audible offers an incredible selection of audiobooks across every genre, like bestsellers, wellness, memoirs, and mystery thrillers. Like my personal favorite within that genre, The Coldest Case. The sound design is stellar and helps so much with the world building in this detective crime thriller. And the performances by the star-studded cast are so good. If you've never tried Audible before, you can start a free trial. Members get full access to a growing selection of included audiobooks, Audible originals, and podcasts. Thanks again to Audible, and now let's get back to it. Just 7 months later, Commodore Perry returned with an even larger fleet consisting of 9 vessels this time and 1,800 men. Knowing it was an unwinnable war if things got violent, the Tokugawa shogunate reluctantly entered negotiations. Just a month later, on March 31st, 1854, they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening up trade with the United States. Let me set the stage here. For the 250 years of peace and isolation, samurai reigned at the top of the social order. They were respected warriors who earned money, land, and titles. They had a job trickling down from the shogunate itself. Life was good for samurai. But when the Americans landed on their shores, the shogunate scrambled. In a battle between katana versus guns, the shogunate abandoned their samurai for a quick path to military modernization. It was basically a mass layoff of an entire class of people. Not just people, warriors. Samurai were loyal subjects who were quickly devalued, jobless, and without a role in society. This decision divided the country, and it broke the samurai class. This was the rise of Ronin. Left astray, Ronin lost faith in the shogunate, seeing it as an outdated, weak, and incompetent governing structure that betrayed Japanese nationalism by rolling over for the Americans. Large groups began to form, and increased numbers of Ronin got involved with political movements and conflicts to destroy the shogunate once and for all. However, not all Ronin opposed their former masters. Those who aligned with the shogunate joined an elite group called the Shinsengumi. And of course, there were also Ronin who went on a much more unsavory path and committed crimes. I think the game does a really good job with letting the player control where they sit politically. Some choices may be more pro-shogunate, while others are anti-shogunate, reminding us that this era was full of turmoil and unrest, and that decisions weren't all black and white. As players, our moral compass may shift in order to fulfill more selfish pursuits versus making choices that benefit the greater good. I mean, I love games like this where your decisions tip your character towards a universal good versus evil, black hat versus white hat, and other favorites that come to mind are like RDR2 and Infamous Second Son. One of the first main allies in the game is Ryoma Sakamoto. He's a charming and eccentric samurai with a hybrid Japanese and American fashion sense, and that's intentionally done because he's based on the real Ryoma Sakamoto, seen here in traditional Japanese fashion and his favorite Western footwear. A lot of the characters' backgrounds that's revealed in dialogues to increase your bond with the character is reflective of the real-life history, and I love that the game included so many real historical figures. I have to admit, I didn't know any of the famous samurai until I started doing this research. This guy is Yukichi Fukuzawa, and I won't get too far into who he is so as not to spoil anything in the game, but here's something interesting I found when I was researching. He's the guy on the Japanese 10,000 yen note. I said at the beginning that what sold me on Rise of the Ronin was its samurai with guns, right? I think it makes the game really fun to play, but more so it reflects the historical reasoning that there's this amalgamation of new and old weaponry and new technology. You've got katana, spear, odachi, as you would expect in a samurai game, but also Western weapons like an American revolver, a saber, a bayonet. Now, firearms had been originally introduced long before this era. The Portuguese initially introduced firearms to Japan, and it was much closer to the era depicted in FX's Shogun, if you're watching that. And let me know in the comments if you'd like me to cover that period in a different video. During Edo, aka the peaceful 250-year period, firearms were heavily controlled. Strict social order meant people stayed subdued and orderly, and samurai were valued for their traditional martial virtues, aka the way of the sword, the way of the samurai. The Japanese mostly rejected the use of firearms, and that led to a decline in the development of them. So the Bakumatsu era introduced an influx of new weapons after a multi-century long halt. If you watched Blue Eye Samurai, then you probably remember how much Mizu resents firearms and Westerners. This might be a little niche, but if you're a complete geek, you might appreciate this. Chronologically speaking, in terms of historical periods, it goes Shogun, Blue Eye Samurai, Rise of the Ronin, and then Rurouni Kenshin. The Treaty of Kanagawa gets signed, and for the next 14 years, Japan is simmering with tension. With the ports now open, Western influence flooded in, bringing not only trade, but also revolutionary ideas and technologies that started reshaping Japanese society from the inside out. Western-style factories started popping up, railways began to sketch new lines across the landscape, and the Ronin, they were watching their world crumble. The Ronin put their support behind the young Emperor Meiji, seen by many as a symbol of national identity. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa shogunate began to lose more and more power as they continued to yield to Western influences. The stage was set for a dramatic, violent showdown. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians became the rallying cry for those who desired to restore power to the emperor and expel Western influences, igniting sparks that would soon fuel the fires of war. Now, here's a perspective that's just big brain 4D chess psychological sniper stuff. There's no record of Commodore Perry and his black ships engaging in actual violence or combat. They didn't need to. Perry's military presence was enough to achieve his objectives of opening up the ports without fighting. And yet, as a result, the Japanese people were at the throats of their own brethren. I think it makes me reflect on how dangerous and destructive it is when an outside force can strategically motivate civil war within a nation, right? Perry yanked away the bridge that connected two sides and just stepped away to watch it burn. So here we are, politics, a quickly evolving society, new technology and ideas, and lots of weapons. The pressure that's been building for 14 years finally comes to a head. This is the Boshin War of 1868. Oh, by the way, if you're playing Rise of the Ronin and you don't want any spoilers for how the game ends, you may want to skip the rest of this video. I personally haven't gotten to the last chapter yet, but I'm almost positive that the main storyline is going to follow the history quite closely. So if you don't want to know how the game ends, I'd probably stop it right here. So thanks for watching. For those of you who want to continue, let's continue. The Emperor's forces, known as the Imperial Faction, were not just some ragtag rebels anymore. These Ronin were well equipped, sporting Western arms and tactics, and guess what? They believed it was time for Japan to modernize. On the flip side, the shogunate forces were desperate to maintain their power in traditional ways. In January 1868, the imperial forces declared the restoration of the young emperor and moved on Kyoto, thus starting the Boshin War. And as the war spread from Edo to the northern reaches of Japan, those loyal to the shogunate found themselves increasingly cornered. City after city fell to the imperial forces, and with each defeat, the age of the shogunate was inching closer to its twilight. The decisive moment came with the fall of Hakodate in May 1869, where the last of the shogunate forces, entrenched in their final stronghold, finally surrendered. You see, this war wasn't just about who ruled Japan. It was a battle of ideologies, a struggle to either leap forward into modern times or to hold on to the past. It was really a war of tradition versus innovation. And it's interesting that the Ronin, who came from this like martial sort of virtue of the samurai way, were the ones who were pushing for reform and forward movement within the country. So, what happens now? The feudal social order is crumbled. It ends with the defeat of the shogunate forces. It ends the war, the Bakumatsu era, the whole Edo era, 250 years of peace, and all that is now finished with the end of this feudal system, the dissolution of the samurai class, and significant changes in Japan's social, political, economic structures. It led into a restoration period called the Meiji era. Everything changes from here, but that's for another day. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something interesting today and that it gave you some context around Rise of the Ronin, whether you play it or not. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to my channel for more videos related to video games and historical breakdowns. And until next time, be well and mata ne.